It was a Saturday night in February 1929. The fog rolled in from the Pacific, settling over Beverly Hills like a gray shroud. High on a hillside overlooking the twinkling lights of Los Angeles, the largest mansion in California stood in silence. Its gray stone walls, imported from Indiana, gleamed faintly in the moonlight. Inside, behind those fortress-like walls, two men lay dying in pools of their own blood. One was the heir to one of America's greatest fortunes. The other was his closest friend, the man who knew all his secrets. By morning, the official story would be written. A murder-suicide, they would say. A secretary gone mad with jealousy and rage. Case closed. But the truth, whatever it was, would be buried along with the bodies. And the questions that night left behind would echo through the halls of Greystone Mansion for nearly a century. To understand what happened inside that guest bedroom on the night of February 16th, 1929, we must first travel back in time. We must trace the fortune that built those gray stone walls, the ambition that raised them toward the sky, and the scandal that would ultimately tear the family apart. This is a story of oil and blood, of fathers and sons, of friendship and betrayal. And at its center stands a house so magnificent, so haunted by tragedy, that it would become the most famous mansion in Hollywood history. The story begins not in Beverly Hills, but in the dusty mining towns of the American frontier. In 1876, a 20-year-old Irishman named Edward Lawrence Doheny arrived in the New Mexico territory with nothing but the clothes on his back and a burning hunger for fortune. His father had fled the Great Famine in Ireland, crossed the Atlantic to find a new life, and died leaving his son with nothing but a legacy of struggle. Young Edward was determined to change that. He would not die poor. He would not die forgotten. He would carve his name into the very earth itself. For 15 years, Doheny wandered the dangerous territories of the American West. He prospected for gold in Arizona. He searched for silver in Nevada. He survived Apache raids, mine collapses, and the bitter cold of mountain winters. He slept under the stars with a rifle at his side and a six-shooter ready for action. The frontier was unforgiving, and many men who sought their fortunes there found only early graves. But Edward Doheny possessed something that set him apart from the other dreamers and drifters. He had patience, he had cunning, and he had an instinct for knowing where the earth hid its treasures. During those long years in the mining camps, Doheny made two friendships that would shape the rest of his life. The first was with Charles Canfield, a steady, hard-working man who would become his business partner. The second was with Albert Fall, a colorful lawyer and political operator who loved poker, whiskey, and power. These three men, forged in the crucible of the frontier, would one day stand at the center of the greatest political scandal in American history. But that was still decades away. For now, they were just hungry young men trying to survive. By 1891, Edward Doheny had given up on the mining camps. He arrived in Los Angeles, California, a broken man. His first wife had left him. His young daughter had died of heart disease. He was so poor he couldn't afford to pay for his boarding room. The great fortune he had chased across the territories seemed as distant as the stars. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. One day, walking through the streets of Los Angeles, Doheny noticed something strange. A man was driving a cart with dark, tarry substance dripping from its wheels. When Doheny asked what it was, the man told him it was brea, the Spanish word for tar. It came from pits near Westlake Park, and a nearby factory was using it for fuel. Most people would have walked on, thinking nothing of it, but Edward Doheny stopped. He stared at that black ooze dripping onto the dusty street, and in that moment, he saw something no one else could see. He saw the future. Doheny knew that beneath those tar pits lay something far more valuable than the sticky black substance itself. There was oil down there, trapped beneath the earth, waiting for someone brave enough and smart enough to find it. He convinced his old friend Charles Canfield to put up $400 to lease a small piece of land. Then, with nothing but picks, shovels, and a sharpened eucalyptus tree trunk for drilling, they began to dig. In the fall of 1892, at a depth of 155 feet, Edward Doheny struck oil. The well wasn't enormous, producing only about 40 barrels a day, but it was enough. It was the first successful oil well in the Los Angeles City oil field, and it would trigger a petroleum boom that transformed Southern California forever. Within a few years, over 3,000 oil wells dotted the landscape of Los Angeles. And Edward Doheny, the penniless prospector who had wandered the frontier for 15 years, became one of the richest men in America. But Doheny's ambition didn't stop at Los Angeles. In 1901, he traveled to Mexico and began drilling in the jungles near Tampico. The risks were enormous. The Mexican Revolution was brewing, and foreign businessmen were often targets of violence. But Doheny pushed forward, and his gamble paid off spectacularly. He discovered some of the richest oil deposits in the world, what they called the Golden Belt. His company, Pan American Petroleum and Transport, became one of the largest oil companies on the planet. By the 1920s, Edward Doheny's fortune was estimated at over $100 million, a staggering sum that would be worth billions today. Yet for all his wealth and power, Doheny's personal life was marked by tragedy. His first daughter had died young. His first marriage had crumbled. In 1900, his first wife Carrie died under mysterious circumstances. The coroner ruled it an accident, saying she had ingested carbolic acid by mistake. But whispers spread through Los Angeles society that it might have been suicide. The harsh life of the mining camps, the loss of their daughter, the strain of their marriage. Perhaps it had all become too much for her to bear. A year after Carrie's death, Doheny remarried. His new wife was Estelle Betzold, a former telephone operator who proved to be the perfect partner for a man of his ambition and temperament. Together, they purchased a magnificent French Gothic mansion at Chester Place, one of Los Angeles's first gated communities. They filled it with art, hosted lavish parties, and donated generously to Catholic charities. The Dohenys had arrived. They were no longer frontier fortune seekers. They were American royalty. But the true center of Edward Doheny's universe was his only surviving child, his son Edward Lawrence Doheny Jr., known to everyone as Ned. Born in 1893, just a year after his father struck oil, Ned grew up surrounded by unimaginable wealth. He was educated at private Catholic schools and attended Stanford before graduating from the University of Southern California. He was handsome, charming, and genuinely kind. Everyone who knew him spoke of his generous heart and easy laugh. He was, by all accounts, a golden boy, heir to an empire built on black gold. In 1914, while courting his future wife Lucy Smith of Pasadena, Ned met a young working-class man named Theodore Hugh Plunkett. Hugh worked at a gas station near Chester Place, and somehow, despite the vast gulf between their social positions, the two young men became inseparable friends. Hugh was quiet, steady, and fiercely loyal. When Ned needed something done, Hugh did it. When Ned needed someone to trust, Hugh was there. Their bond was deep and complicated. More than employer and employee, more than just friends. When America entered the Great War in 1917, both Ned and Hugh enlisted and served overseas. The experience bound them even closer together. After the war, Hugh became Ned's personal secretary, traveling with him everywhere, handling his affairs, and becoming increasingly indispensable to the entire Doheny family. He signed checks totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. He attended to the most sensitive matters. He knew every secret the family had. Some observers noted that the relationship between Ned and Hugh seemed unusually close. An attorney who knew them both later remarked that their relationship was more than that of friends. What exactly that meant, no one would say directly. But the whispers would only grow louder after the tragedy that was to come. In 1921, everything changed. Edward Doheny Sr. had remained close with his old friend from the mining camps, Albert Fall. Fall had risen from frontier lawyer to become a United States Senator from New Mexico, and when Warren Harding won the presidency, Fall was appointed Secretary of the Interior. It was the culmination of a lifetime of political maneuvering, and it would be his downfall. Fall had access to something enormously valuable, federal oil reserves that had been set aside for the United States Navy. One reserve was at Teapot Dome in Wyoming. Two others were at Elk Hills and Buena Vista in California. These were strategic national assets, meant to ensure the Navy would always have fuel for its ships. They were supposed to be protected from private exploitation. But Albert Fall saw an opportunity, and so did his old friend Edward Doheny. On November 28, 1921, just 3 days after Doheny made a proposal to lease the Elk Hills Reserve, something extraordinary happened. Ned Doheny and Hugh Plunkett traveled to a brokerage house in New York. There they withdrew $100,000 in cash from Ned's account. They wrapped the money in paper, placed it in a small black bag, and carried it to the Wardman Park Hotel in Washington. Inside Albert Fall's apartment, Ned handed over the bag. Fall counted the money while the two young men watched. Later, Ned would claim that Fall gave him a receipt for the loan. That receipt, if it ever existed, was never found. The money was a bribe, pure and simple. In exchange for $100,000, delivered in cash by the son of an oil tycoon to the Secretary of the Interior, Doheny's company received exclusive rights to drill on federal land. There was no competitive bidding. There was no public announcement. It was a secret deal between old friends, sealed with a black bag full of cash, and it would become the centerpiece of the greatest political scandal before Watergate. The scheme might have remained hidden forever, if not for the greed of another oil man. Harry Sinclair, who had bribed Fall with an even larger sum to lease Teapot Dome, couldn't resist flaunting his newfound access to government oil reserves. Questions began to be asked. Investigations began. By 1924, the Teapot Dome scandal had exploded into national headlines. Senate investigators discovered Fall's sudden wealth, his paid-off ranch taxes that had been 10 years overdue, his expensive new cattle. They traced the money. They followed the paper trail, and eventually, they found their way to that black bag carried by Ned Doheny and Hugh Plunkett. Both Ned and Hugh were called to testify before Congress. The pressure was immense. Ned was forced to admit under oath that he had delivered $100,000 in cash to a government official. His father tried to frame it as an innocent loan between old friends, insisting that the money had nothing to do with the oil leases. but no one believed him. The Doheny name, once synonymous with success and philanthropy, became synonymous with corruption. The family that had clawed its way from poverty to unimaginable wealth now found itself at the center of a national disgrace. Meanwhile, construction continued on the grandest gift a father had ever given a son. In 1926, Edward Doheny Sr. had purchased a premium parcel of land, nearly 13 acres on the eastern edge of Beverly Hills, with sweeping views of the entire Los Angeles basin. He hired architect Gordon Kaufman, a rising star who would later design the Hoover Dam, to create a home unlike anything California had ever seen. The estate would be called Greystone, named for its abundant use of gray Indiana limestone. It would be a castle for his beloved son Ned, a monument to the Doheny legacy. Construction began on February 15, 1927, and would take 3 years to complete. No expense was spared. The main house alone covered 46,000 square feet and contained 55 rooms. There were oak banisters and rafters carved entirely by hand. The grand hall featured checkerboard floors of black and white Italian marble. Fine walnut paneling covered the walls. 7 different artisans designed and sculpted each of the chimneys. The estate included stables, kennels, tennis courts, a fire station, a gatehouse, a swimming pool with a pavilion, a greenhouse, a lake with cascading waterfalls, and meticulously landscaped gardens that would rival any palace in Europe. The total cost exceeded $3 million, an almost unimaginable sum in the 1920s, equivalent to over $50 million today. When completed, it was the most expensive home ever built in California. But here is where the story takes a darker turn. While Greystone was being built, stone by stone, it was not Ned Doheny who oversaw the construction. He was too busy in Washington, supporting his father through the endless trials and investigations of the Teapot Dome scandal. The man who supervised the building of Greystone, who signed the checks, who paid the contractors, who attended to every detail of the magnificent estate, was Hugh Plunkett. He was building, in essence, a palace for his best friend, a home he would never live in, a monument to a family that would soon be torn apart. In the fall of 1928, with the house nearing completion, something began to change in Hugh Plunkett. Family servants noticed that the once quiet, even-tempered secretary was starting to unravel. He seemed nervous, agitated, unable to sleep. His hands sometimes trembled. He would stare into space for long minutes, lost in thoughts he shared with no one. Those closest to him whispered that Hugh was coming undone, that the pressure of the scandal, the weight of what he knew, the uncertainty of what lay ahead, was crushing him. On Christmas Eve, 1928, Hugh suffered what appeared to be a complete nervous breakdown. His marriage was falling apart. The upcoming trials weighed on him like stones. He knew things, dangerous things, about the Doheny family's dealings with Albert Fall. Soon he would be called to testify again. What would he say? What would he be forced to reveal? And what would happen to him, the working-class boy from the gas station, when the rich and powerful no longer needed him? In late September 1928, Ned Doheny, his wife Lucy, and their 5 children finally moved into their magnificent new home. Greystone was everything Edward Doheny Sr. had dreamed it would be. From its terraces, the family could gaze out over Beverly Hills, over the sprawling city below, all the way to the oil fields in the distance that had made their fortune possible. They had arrived at the pinnacle of American wealth and privilege, but their time in paradise would be measured not in years, but in months. By February 1929, those close to the Dohenys claimed that Hugh Plunkett was completely unhinged. On the afternoon of February 16th, a Saturday, the family doctor, E.C. Fishbaugh, came to Greystone along with Ned and Lucy. They confronted Hugh and urged him to check himself into a sanitarium. "Get some rest," they told him. "Get help. We'll take care of everything until you're better." Was this genuinely about Hugh's mental health? Or was it about keeping him quiet before Albert Fall's upcoming bribery trial? Perhaps both. We will never know. What we do know is that Hugh refused. He sat there in that magnificent house, the house he had helped build, almost shaking at times, his hands clenched, his jaw set. He said he would come out of it all right. The doctor could see it was no use to push him further. So he left. That evening, according to the official story, Ned and Lucy drove to Hugh's apartment in Hollywood to try once more. They urged him again to get help. During this visit, Ned apparently said something, some impulsive remarks, that deeply upset Hugh. The nature of those remarks was never revealed. Then Ned and Lucy returned to Greystone, to their beautiful home on the hill, to their 5 sleeping children. And they waited. Around 9:30 that night, Hugh Plunkett drove up to Greystone. Because he was a regular fixture in the family, the gatekeeper let him through without question. Hugh had his own key to the mansion, and he let himself in. He made his way to a guest bedroom in the east wing. Then, using the house switchboard, he called Ned and asked if they could talk. What happened in that room will never be known with certainty. The official story, pieced together from statements by Lucy Dehaney and Dr. Fishbaugh, goes like this. Around 11 o'clock, Lucy heard a single gunshot echo through the mansion. She did not immediately investigate. Instead, she called the family doctor, not the police, and asked him to come at once. Dr. Fishbaugh was at a theater in downtown Beverly Hills. He left immediately and drove up to the house, a journey of about 10 minutes. When the doctor arrived, Lucy met him at the imposing front door and led him toward the east wing. As they approached the guest bedroom, Hugh Plunkett suddenly emerged. He was in a state of anguish, and he was holding a gun. When he saw the doctor and Lucy, he ran back into the room and slammed the door. Then, according to both witnesses, they heard another gunshot. More than 20 minutes had passed since Lucy heard the first shot. Why had Hugh been alive and walking around all that time? The official story never explained. When Dr. Fishbaugh and Lucy entered the room, they found 2 bodies. Hugh Plunkett lay on the floor in a pool of blood, a bullet wound in his head. Ned Dehaney also lay dead on the floor, in his own pool of blood, also shot through the head. The gun, still gripped in Hugh's hand, belonged to Ned. The scene was one of horror and chaos. The room smelled of gunpowder and blood, and standing in the doorway was a widow who had just lost her husband, in a house they had occupied for only 4 months. The police were not called for nearly 3 hours. When they finally arrived, the scene had been cleaned and organized. The bodies had been moved. Crucial evidence had been disturbed or destroyed. The investigation that followed was perfunctory at best. Within days, the official verdict was announced. Hugh Plunkett, suffering from a nervous disorder or perhaps angry over not receiving a raise, had murdered Ned Dehaney and then turned the gun on himself. Case closed. But almost nothing about the official story made sense. Why had Lucy waited so long to call anyone? Why had she called the family doctor instead of the police? Why had Hugh been alive and holding a gun more than 20 minutes after the first shot was fired? If Hugh shot Ned and then himself, why did the forensic evidence suggest that Hugh had been shot from farther away than a suicide would allow? And why in a house with servants and staff did no one else hear or see anything? Then there was the matter of the burial. The Doheny family was devoutly Catholic. Edward Doheny Sr. and his wife had donated millions to Catholic charities, churches, and schools. By all rights, Ned should have been buried in Calvary Cemetery, the Catholic cemetery where the rest of the family would eventually rest. But he wasn't. Both Ned and Hugh were buried at Forest Lawn, a secular cemetery, within a few hundred yards of each other. In the Catholic faith of that era, those who died by their own hand were not permitted burial in consecrated ground. Did the family believe or know that Ned had actually killed Hugh and then himself? Was the official story of murder-suicide reversed, a cover-up to protect the Doheny name? Had Hugh discovered something, or threatened to reveal something, that drove Ned to violence? Or was there another explanation entirely, something even darker that no one wanted to acknowledge? Almost immediately, rumors began to swirl. Some whispered that Ned and Hugh had been more than friends, that their relationship was romantic, and that the shootings were the result of a lover's quarrel. Others suggested that Lucy had discovered them together and killed them both in a rage. Still others believed that Hugh, knowing he would be forced to testify against the Dohenys, had been silenced to protect the family from further scandal. The $100,000 in that black bag, the bribe that had corrupted a cabinet secretary and shamed a president, had perhaps claimed 2 more victims. The truth died in that guest bedroom on the night of February 16, 1929. It died with 2 men who had known each other since they were teenagers, who had served together in war, who had built an empire and a mansion together, and who now lay silent in pools of their own blood. The gray stone walls of Greystone, the most magnificent home in California, had become the scene of its most haunting mystery. And the questions that night left behind would never be answered. Edward Doheny Sr. was acquitted of bribery charges the following year, though Albert Fall was convicted of accepting the very same bribe. It was one of the great legal paradoxes of American history. How could one man be guilty of taking money that another man was innocent of giving? The answer, of course, was power. The Dohenys had the best lawyers money could buy. They had connections in high places. They had a name that, despite everything, still commanded respect. But the acquittal brought no peace to Edward Doheny. His son was dead. His fortune was diminished by lawsuits and settlements. His reputation was forever tarnished. The man who had clawed his way from nothing, who had struck oil in a tar pit and built an empire, spent his final years as a reclusive invalid in his Chester Place mansion. He died in 1935, 6 years after his son. His dreams of dynasty turned to ashes. And what of Greystone? What of that magnificent house on the hill, the most expensive home in California, the scene of the most mysterious double murder in Beverly Hills history? That story continues, and in some ways, it was only beginning. The morning after the shootings, the Los Angeles newspapers exploded with headlines. The son of one of America's richest men, dead in his own mansion. His secretary, dead beside him. A murder-suicide, they proclaimed, the tragic end of a friendship torn apart by madness. The official investigation lasted only a few days. No charges were filed. No arrests were made. The district attorney's office accepted the story that Lucy Doheny and Dr. Fishbaugh had provided, and the case was quietly closed. But in the drawing rooms and private clubs of Los Angeles, the whispers never stopped. People who knew the family traded theories about what had really happened in that guest bedroom. Some believed the official story. Hugh Plunkett, they said, had simply snapped under the pressure of the scandal and his own failing marriage. He had killed his best friend in a moment of madness, then turned the gun on himself. It was tragic, but it was simple. These things happened, even in the finest homes. Others were not so sure. They pointed to the strange inconsistencies in the official account. Why had Lucy waited so long to call for help? Why had she called the family doctor instead of the police? Why had Hugh been alive and walking around more than 20 minutes after the first gunshot? And why, when the police finally arrived, had the scene already been cleaned and the bodies moved? It seemed as though someone had wanted to control the narrative, to make certain that only one version of events would ever be told. Then there were the darker whispers, the ones spoken only in hushed tones behind closed doors. Some suggested that Ned and Hugh had been more than friends, that their relationship had crossed lines that 1920s society could not accept. Perhaps Lucy had discovered them together. Perhaps she had taken matters into her own hands. Or perhaps Hugh, driven mad by love and jealousy, had killed the man he could never truly have. Others pointed to the Teapot Dome scandal and the trials that were still grinding forward in Washington. Both Ned and Hugh had been present when that black bag of money was delivered to Albert Fall. Both were potential witnesses in upcoming prosecutions. Hugh, in particular, had seemed increasingly unstable as the trial dates approached. Had he been silenced to protect the family? Had someone decided that dead men tell no tales? The most explosive theory of all suggested that the official story had it backwards. Perhaps it was not Hugh who had killed Ned, but Ned who had killed Hugh. Perhaps the heir to the Doheny fortune, facing ruin and disgrace, had murdered the friend who knew too much and then turned the gun on himself. This would explain why Ned was buried in a secular cemetery rather than in consecrated Catholic ground. It would explain why the family had worked so hard to control the scene before the police arrived. And it would explain why, nearly a century later, the case remains officially unsolved. We will never know the truth. The only witnesses were the dead, and they took their secrets to the grave. But the mystery that began on that February night in 1929 would hang over Greystone Mansion like a shadow, following it through the decades, becoming part of its legend, inseparable from the gray stone walls themselves. In the weeks and months that followed the tragedy, Lucy Doheny faced an impossible choice. She could leave Greystone, abandon the magnificent home where her husband had died, and try to start over somewhere else. Or she could stay, raise her 5 children in the house their father had built for them, and refuse to let tragedy define their lives. Lucy chose to stay. It could not have been easy. Every day she walked past the guest bedroom where the bodies had been found. Every night she slept in the same wing where her husband had drawn his last breath. The servants whispered about strange sounds in the corridors, footsteps in empty rooms, doors that opened and closed on their own. But Lucy Doheny was made of stronger stuff than most. She had married into one of the most powerful families in America, and she would not be driven from her home by ghosts, whether real or imagined. Almost exactly 1 year after her husband's death, Lucy remarried. Her new husband was Lee Batson, an investment dealer whom she and Ned had known for years. The wedding took place in the living room at Greystone, in front of the massive fireplace, surrounded by spring blossoms and American beauty roses. It was a quiet ceremony, far from the lavish affairs that had once filled these halls. But it marked a new beginning. Lucy was determined to reclaim her life. For the next 26 years, Lucy and Lee Batson raised her children at Greystone. They hosted parties in the grand dining room and swam in the magnificent pool. They walked through the gardens that Paultine had designed with such care, past the cascading waterfalls and babbling brooks. The house that had witnessed such horror became once again a home. Lucy's grandchildren would later remember playing in the tunnels beneath the mansion, exploring the secret passages that connected the rooms. One grandson recalled the terror of getting lost in those dark corridors, knowing that no one would hear you if you called for help, that you might become a skeleton before you were found. Meanwhile, the man who had built Greystone watched his world crumble. Edward Doheny Sr. never recovered from his son's death. Although he was acquitted of bribery charges in 1930, the verdict brought him no joy. His health declined rapidly. His once legendary energy faded. He spent his final years as a recluse in his Chester Place mansion, surrounded by the art and luxury that no longer meant anything to him. In 1935, 6 years after Ned's death, Edward Lawrence Doheny died. The newspapers said he died of a broken heart. It was as good an explanation as any. His widow, Estelle, devoted the rest of her life to erasing the stain of scandal from the Doheny name. She donated tens of millions of dollars to Catholic churches and charities. She built a magnificent library at the University of Southern California in memory of Ned. She burned all of her husband's personal papers, ensuring that whatever secrets he had carried would die with him. The Doheny name would be remembered for philanthropy, she was determined, not for corruption. But she also did something curious. She arranged for Ned to be buried outside the Catholic Church in secular ground at Forest Lawn Cemetery. Hugh Plunkett was buried just a few hundred yards away. Two men who had died together, now resting together for eternity. If Ned had truly been murdered by Hugh, why would the family bury them so close together? And if Ned had died in a state of mortal sin, having taken his own life, why would the church allow him to be honored with a library bearing his name? The contradictions piled up, but the questions went unanswered. The Doheny family had the wealth and the connections to ensure that the official story remained the only story. And so it did, for decades, while Greystone stood silent on its hill, keeping its secrets behind gray stone walls. By the early 1950s, Lucy Doheny Batson was ready for a change. Her children had grown and moved away. The massive estate, with its 55 rooms and endless grounds, had become too much for an aging couple to maintain. The cost of keeping Greystone running was staggering. Every month brought new repairs, new expenses, new reminders that this monument to wealth required a fortune just to preserve. In 1955, Lucy made the difficult decision to leave the home where she had spent nearly 3 decades. She sold the majority of the original land, over 400 acres, to Paul Trousdale, a developer who would transform it into the prestigious Trousdale Estates. Today, those hills are covered with luxury homes worth tens of millions of dollars, their famous residents including celebrities, moguls, and stars. The very ground that Edward Doheny once rode on horseback is now some of the most valuable real estate in the world. The following year, Lucy and Lee sold the remaining parcel, including Greystone Mansion itself, to Henry Crown of Chicago for approximately $1.5 million. Crown was a formidable businessman who owned, among other things, the Empire State Building. He had grand plans for Greystone. But when his wife learned the history of the house, learned about the double murder in the guest bedroom, she refused to set foot inside. The family never moved in. Greystone stood empty, abandoned, its 55 rooms gathering dust, its gardens slowly returning to wilderness. Crown leased the property to film studios, and for the first time, Greystone began its second life as a backdrop for Hollywood dreams. In 1963, Henry Crown announced that he intended to demolish Greystone Mansion and subdivide the remaining land into smaller lots. The news sent shockwaves through Beverly Hills. Here was one of the most magnificent estates in California, a masterpiece of architecture designed by Gordon Kaufman, about to be reduced to rubble. A citizens' committee formed to save the mansion. For 2 years, the city of Beverly Hills negotiated with Crown, trying to find a way to preserve this piece of history. Finally, on November 3, 1965, an agreement was reached. The city purchased Greystone and its grounds for $1,100,000. The demolition was canceled. The mansion was saved. But the question remained. What do you do with a haunted palace that no one wants to live in? The city found a creative solution. In 1965, they leased Greystone to the American Film Institute for $1 per year. In exchange, the Institute would maintain the property and use it as a campus for training the next generation of filmmakers. For the next 17 years, some of the most influential directors, writers, and cinematographers in Hollywood history walked the halls of Greystone, studying their craft in the shadow of its dark past. David Lynch, the visionary director of Twin Peaks and Mulholland Drive, filmed scenes for his disturbing debut film Eraserhead in the mansion's stables. Paul Schrader, who would go on to write Taxi Driver and direct American Gigolo, honed his skills within these walls. Young filmmakers learned to frame shots in the grand staircase, to light scenes in the oak-paneled library, to capture the melancholy beauty of a house that had seen too much. Greystone, built for one family's private pleasure, was becoming a training ground for generations of storytellers. On September 16, 1971, the entire estate was formally dedicated as a public park by the city of Beverly Hills. The gates that had once kept the world at bay were thrown open. Anyone could now walk through the gardens that Paul Thien had designed, past the fountains and terraces, and gaze up at the gray stone walls that had witnessed such tragedy and beauty. 5 years later, on April 23, 1976, Greystone was officially recognized as a historic landmark and entered into the National Register of Historic Places. When the American Film Institute's lease ended in 1982, Greystone passed back into the city's hands. The mansion was in terrible disrepair after years of use as a film school. The city began a restoration project that continues to this day, costing $1 to $2 million annually. Slowly, room by room, the grandeur that Edward Doheny had envisioned began to emerge once more. The oak banisters were polished, the marble floors were restored. The gardens bloomed again with the same varieties of roses and flowers that had delighted Lucy Doheny nearly a century before. But even as Greystone was being restored to its original glory, it was also becoming something new, something its builders could never have imagined. It was becoming one of the most famous filming locations in Hollywood history. The irony was perfect. A house built by an oil tycoon whose story inspired the novel Oil, which in turn inspired the film There Will Be Blood, had become the backdrop for countless other tales of ambition, wealth, and power. Director Paul Thomas Anderson brought Daniel Day-Lewis to Greystone in 2007 to film the climactic scene of There Will Be Blood, a movie loosely based on Edward Doheny's life. They shot in the mansion's two-lane bowling alley, which had to be fully restored for the production. In that scene, Day-Lewis's character, Daniel Plainview, confronts his nemesis in an explosion of violence that echoes the real violence that once stained these walls. It was fitting that a story inspired by Doheny would return to Doheny's greatest monument for its most memorable moment. The list of productions filmed at Greystone reads like a history of American cinema and television. The Grand Staircase, with its carved oak banisters and soaring ceilings, has become one of the most famous sets in Hollywood. It appeared as the Green Goblin's Manhattan penthouse in 3 Spider-Man films. The Coen brothers transformed the interior into the Lebowski Mansion for the Big Lebowski. Christopher Nolan used it as the home of Robert Angier in The Prestige. David Fincher shot scenes for The Social Network within these walls. The Holiday, The Bodyguard, Batman and Robin, Star Trek Into Darkness, The Muppets, National Treasure, Ghostbusters, X-Men, the list goes on and on. Television has been equally drawn to Greystone's grandeur. Gilmore Girls filmed multiple episodes here. Murder, She Wrote used it twice. Heart to Heart, Knight Rider, Dynasty, Falcon Crest, The Mentalist, Prison Break, House, NCIS, Dark Shadows. Each found something different in these rooms, a backdrop for romance or mystery or murder. The house that witnessed real death has become the setting for countless fictional ones. But perhaps the most haunting production of all is The Manor, a play that has been performed at Greystone every year since 2002. Written by Catherine Bates and directed by Beverly Olivan, it tells a fictionalized version of the Doheny story. The audience is divided into groups and led through different rooms of the mansion, watching scenes unfold in the actual spaces where history happened. You might find yourself in the guest bedroom where the bodies were discovered, watching actors recreate the final moments of Ned Doheny and Hugh Plunkett. You might stand in the grand hall where Lucy received the news of her husband's death. The Manor has become the longest-running play in Los Angeles history, a testament to the enduring fascination with Greystone's dark past. And then there are the ghosts. Park rangers and visitors alike have reported strange experiences at Greystone. Faucets turn on by themselves in empty bathrooms. Doors open and close when no one is near them. Footsteps echo in corridors where no one walks. Some have claimed to catch the scent of lilac perfume drifting through the halls, the same perfume that Lucy Doheny wore during her decades in the house. Others have reported something far more disturbing, the unmistakable smell of rotting flesh in the bedroom where the bodies were found, a smell that appears without warning and vanishes just as suddenly. Visitors have seen shadowy figures in the windows, shapes that move through rooms that should be empty. Some believe these are the spirits of Ned and Hugh, trapped forever in the house where they died, unable to find peace because the truth of their deaths was never told. Others think it is Lucy herself, still walking the halls she refused to abandon in life, watching over the home she loved even in death. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, there is something undeniably eerie about Greystone. The weight of its history presses down on you as you walk through its rooms. The silence seems heavier here, the shadows darker. Even on the brightest California day, something sad lingers in the air. Lucy Doheny Batson lived to be 100 years old. She outlived her first husband by 64 years, her second husband by decades. In her final years, according to her grandchildren, she would wake each morning, dress carefully as if for a luncheon engagement, and sit in a wingback chair in her living room with her purse in her lap. And wait. What was she waiting for? Perhaps she was waiting for old friends who had long since passed. Perhaps she was waiting for answers to questions that had haunted her for 7 decades. Perhaps she was simply waiting for the end, ready to finally rest after a life marked by tragedy and resilience. When she died in 1993, Lucy Doheny Batson took the last of the secrets with her. Whatever she knew about what really happened on the night of February 16, 1929, died when she did. The guest bedroom at Greystone keeps its silence. The gray stone walls reveal nothing. Today, Greystone Mansion stands as it has for nearly a century, overlooking the city that Edward Doheny helped to build. The gardens are immaculately maintained, the terraces swept clean, the fountains still cascading into pools that reflect the California sky. Weddings are held on the lawns, where Lucy once hosted parties for Hollywood royalty. Tourists walk through the grounds, posing for photographs in front of the grand entrance, often unaware of the blood that was spilled within. Children attend summer camps in the shadow of the mansion, their laughter echoing off walls that have heard screams and gunshots and the silence of death. Every year, thousands of visitors pass through the iron gates of Greystone. Some come for the architecture, to marvel at Gordon Kaufman's masterpiece of Tudor revival design. Some come for the gardens, to walk the paths that Paul Thien laid out with such care. Some come because they recognize the grand staircase from their favorite movie, eager to stand where Daniel Day-Lewis or Jeff Bridges or Tobey Maguire once stood. And some come for the mystery, drawn by whispered tales of murder and ghosts, hoping to catch a glimpse of something beyond the ordinary, some echo of the tragedy that made this place famous. The story of Greystone is, in many ways, the story of America itself. It is a story of ambition and achievement, of a man who rose from nothing to build an empire. It is a story of corruption and scandal, of the price that power demands and the compromises that wealth requires. It is a story of family and friendship, of bonds that held through war and hardship, only to shatter in a moment of violence that no one can explain. And it is a story of endurance, of a house that has survived tragedy, neglect, and the threat of demolition to stand today as one of the most magnificent estates in the nation. Edward Doheny struck oil in a tar pit and built an empire. He gave his son a palace on a hill, a monument to love and legacy. But he could not protect that son from the darkness that follows wealth and power. He could not keep death from walking through those grand doors and taking everything that mattered. In the end, all the money in the world could not save Ned Doheny. All the lawyers and influence could not bury the truth forever. All the gray stone in Indiana could not build walls strong enough to keep out sorrow. The mystery of what happened on the night of February 16, 1929, will never be solved. Too much time has passed. Too many witnesses have died. Too many secrets have been buried, along with the bodies, in the quiet earth of Forest Lawn Cemetery. But perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps some stories are not meant to have endings. Perhaps the questions matter more than the answers ever could. When you stand on the terrace at Greystone and look out over Beverly Hills, you see the same view that Ned Doheny saw on the last morning of his life. The hills roll down to the basin below. The city spreads out in every direction, a testament to dreams and determination. And somewhere beneath your feet, buried under asphalt and concrete and the foundations of million-dollar homes, the oil that made it all possible still flows, black and ancient and patient, waiting in the dark. The house remains, the gardens bloom, the mystery endures. And the gray stone walls of Greystone Mansion stand watch over Beverly Hills, as they have for nearly 100 years, keeping their secrets, guarding their ghosts, waiting for someone to finally tell the truth about what happened on that February night when two men died and a legend was born. Some stories end with answers. This one ends with questions. But perhaps that is the most honest ending of all. For in the end, we are all just visitors here, walking through rooms that others have walked before, leaving our own mysteries behind for future generations to ponder. The walls remember everything. The walls say nothing. And the house on the hill, built of gray stone and dreams, stands eternal, magnificent, and forever haunted by the weight of all it has witnessed.